Анна, тогда как можно будет начинать? Вы нам подайте знак.
Обязательно, да,
So,
буквально.
Anna, please let me know when we can start. Yeah, we'll start in just a minute, okay? Just a second.
Так, доброе утро, уважаемые коллеги, уважаемые очные и заочные участники.
All right. Good morning, everyone, all those present offline and online, and those watching us on our YouTube channel. We are happy to welcome all of you at another panel session of a conference, which we decided to make available online because this is a particularly relevant subject. Can international agreements make global politics green? We are not the only ones looking for answers to these questions. The leading politicians of our countries represented here, and other countries as well, are also looking for such answers. This is particularly relevant agenda, so let's have a discussion. I give the floor to our moderator this morning. Due to various pandemic-related restrictions, we're not able to meet face-to-face, but we're still very happy to have this discussion regardless of all the difficulties. So I give you Anastasia Tsvetkova, director of the Lake Baikal Foundation. She will be our moderator today. Anastasia? Yes. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for the introduction. I would like to welcome all the participants of the Dialogue for the Future conference at our panel discussion, which is really important for all the politicians, economists, businessmen, and international relations experts who are gathered currently, both offline and online. This is truly an international issue. So that's why our dialogue will not be limited to a particular place. It will be an international dialogue spanning the whole globe. Because these matters involve a lot of actors. We need to answer the question whether international agreements can make global politics green. Let me remind you, back in 1998, the Kyoto Protocol was approved. This was the first document addressing climate change. It was ratified by 191 countries, but it failed to achieve the desired results. China, the United States, and India, the leading polluters, refused to abide by the Kyoto Protocol. Then we had the Paris Climate Deal of 2015. States took up obligations to stay under 2 degrees centigrade. There were other discussions. And finally, in 2019, at the SDG summit, the decade of action was proclaimed. We need to accelerate our progress in achieving the 17 SDGs. And the central focus in this decade, in addition to fighting poverty and fighting for gender equality, the need to address climate-related emergencies was also emphasized. So climate dialogue continues at this level as well. And in 2021, at the World Economic Forum, a report was given prioritizing epidemics as the #1 risk and climate change as #2. And changing weather conditions, which is again a result of climate change and We see wildfires and floods, and this is very obvious to everyone by now. So, in order to address these challenges, we have to ramp up our efforts and intensify international dialogue. But according to the International Energy Agency, a lot has to be done. We need to increase our solar and wind power generation fivefold. All these initiatives are reflected in strategic document, and they were discussed at COP26 recently. And all this indicates that we may see inflation very soon. Prices will go up around the globe. And even right now, we see countries introducing new regulation related to this energy transition. For example, we all know about the Green Deal in the EU. And we see countries thinking about consequences of this new regulation. They have to respond to that. Businesses have to, businesses who export their products have to make some adjustments. So making politics green is now a big challenge. And a recent report by Deloitte says that most business leaders say they had to trim down their green projects because of the pandemic and resulting financial difficulties. At the same time, we see more and more regulation already happening and in the immediate future. So our question today is whether international agreements can make global politics green. Should we expect new international alliances in this respect? Who will be part of those alliances? What kind of approaches can Russia offer to the international community in this regard? This is another question we should look at it. So let me introduce the speakers at our discussion today who will address these matters. And then they will take a few questions from the audience, those present at the Gorchikov Foundation and watching us online. So we have Lola Vallejo, Climate Program Director at the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations. We have Dhruba Purkayastha, Director of the India section at the Climate Policy Initiative. And we also have Igor Tomberg, MGIMO professor. So let's start with Lola Vallejo, Climate Program Director at IDDRI, the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations. So Lola, what do you think we should expect in the near future?
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here today. And I would like to maybe try and answer the questions you have asked by using the latest COP26 in Glasgow as an excuse to understand how can international agreements make the global politics go green. So I'd like to focus on those key outcomes and then say a bit more about what is happening at EU level, maybe for the members of the audience who might be less. So first we talk about one COP, one climate conference, but what's interesting is all the more since the Paris Agreement, the new framework, we see two COPs. One is still the official arena where representatives from governments negotiate a text, and I've pasted an example of this text, the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is important because it sends a political signal of where multilateral climate action is at. But no less important is what I call the sideshow, but is actually becoming a more central part of climate action, which is a range of coalitions, statements from public and private actors together, committing to do more than what can be agreed in a multilateral consensus under the UN framework. And these two are very important in taking stock of what happened at COP and what is everyone around the world willing to do. There are also other dynamics at play. It was very significant that during the Glasgow COP, the United States and China together committed to strengthen their collaboration on climate action. It really shows that despite some very fraught geopolitical tensions, really key actors can overcome their differences and see climate as an area that is somehow protected on international cooperation. It is not devoid of tensions, but at least it's an area where we understand that the common interest is stronger. There is also an important role for the civil society in the whole process that plays a really important part to encourage all participants to do more and really call for greater transparency of the proceedings. And they're a vital part of the whole mechanism of multilateral climate action. I'm going to focus on some key results. First, the main one, which is reducing emissions. The primary goal of the UK presidency of the COP was to keep the objective of 1.5 degrees alive. And to have and remember why COP26 in Glasgow was important, we need to remember that the new Paris Agreement signed in 2015 is a dynamic one, and it is built around 5-year cycles. It's an agreement which is where countries are legally bound to participate, but the content of their participation is nationally determined. But the way we think through the Paris Agreement, we can close the gap in ambition between the common objective and what countries submit is to have a regular rhythm of submission. So countries were expected with more, with better and enhanced pledges at COP. And it's almost like a staircase. Every 5 years, countries are expected to come with better pledges. So Glasgow was important because it was the first milestones where countries were expected with better pledges. And each one need to represent a progression compared to the previous one. So generally, for most countries, it was on the same implementation period, but you're committed to do more because you recognize that the technologies and the international conditions for actions had considerably improved since you previously submitted your commitment. Now, since the Paris Agreement, there has been progress. If you take stock of all the country pledges in 2015 and the ones submitted again in 2021, you can see that the expected emissions in 2030 are lower than what they were in the first set of pledges. You can see it on the graph. This is a synthesis done by the United Nations Secretariat. And there have been some new NDCs submitted, including from China and India, with enhanced commitments in the short term, and also some longer term commitments to reach carbon neutrality at various dates. Just to have this in mind, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, set in its 2018 to limit warming to 1.5 and avoid the worst effects of climate change, we need to reduce emissions by 45% in 2030 compared to 2010, just to have this in mind. So you can already tell that we are far off the mark. So we have done progress, but it's far from enough. Even though NDCs have gone marginally better, they still correspond to an absolute increase in emissions by 2030, when they should, as I said, considerably decrease. So we need to do collectively a lot better. I will be a bit more specific. There have been many assessments trying to take stock of where the commitments to date would take us in terms of levels of warming. There are a lot of assumptions behind those numbers, so I don't want to spend time on the numbers. I just want to flag that there are two gaps to fill. One between the many long-term commitments taken by an increasing number of countries. Now, about 3/4 of global emissions are covered by a carbon neutrality target, including Russia, for instance, has taken a neutrality target. In many places, the short-term commitments are not aligned with this long-term ambition. And so there is a mismatch between the short-term and the long-term. But maybe more worrying is the second gap, is the gap between the current policies in place in countries and the short-term commitments. So you need to increase both the short-term commitments, but also the policies to deliver them, because this is what is going to actually deliver emission reduction. COP26 took stock of a knowledge that there was a delay, and faced with this failure, said that actually countries would be called with better, strengthened, revisited NDCs as early as next year. And so countries are expected to come back to the next COP in 2022 with better NDCs and justifying how they meet the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. A very significant outcome is, for the first time, there was discussion of the main culprit of climate change, which are fossil fuels, which are responsible for a lot of the warming that we see. And there have been a call to end inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, recognizing that it is mandatory to continue funding what is the cause of the problem. There have been also, for the first time, a singling out of coal as a particular culprit in global emissions, and a collective call to phase down coal consumption and production. And this is the first time in 26 COPs that we actually talk about the main problem. So this is significant. And even though there are a lot of difficult politics behind it, it signals that the conditions have improved to have discussions about fossil fuel phase out globally, and to discuss about not whether to do it, but the how to do it in a just manner that doesn't make societies and economies suffer. There was also agreement on the rules. Most of the rules of the Paris Agreement, the rules of implementation of the agreement, were agreed in 2018, but some chapters were still left open. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because common rules are a key reason why this multilateral agreement, the Paris Agreement, is a force for action. And in Glasgow, there were some much more precise rules that were decided on transparency, because the action is self-determined by countries. The only way you can have a system that works is to have the glue of transparency and the trust on who does what. Do countries report their actual emissions? How can you know what they're each doing? Are they making progress in implementing their commitments? This is the key role that transparency plays in the framework. There was also agreement to agree on common duration of commitments, meaning the durations of the commitments of countries is 5 years. And this is important, again, to take stock in a transparent manner of how far we are compared to a collective. There were also some rules agreed on what we call voluntary cooperation. In short, it's international carbon markets. These are very important because we expect that the private sector is going to want those credits. We also know that a lot of countries are planning to use international carbon credits in their updated NDC. Before, in the Kyoto Protocol mentioned by a moderator, we only had one set of countries that had emission reduction goals, another one which didn't. So any reduction that happened in developing countries was additional. But in the Paris world, it's very different, because all countries are committed to tackling climate change. And the main risk was to have a double counting of emission, where the buyer country and the seller country would both try to claim the same credits. And that was a major risk, which meant that we could not agree on in 2018 and 2019. But finally, in 2021, there was an agreement, and the worst risks of double counting are avoided. But of course, the devil will be in the details, and there is a lot of potential for these rules to be implemented either with a high integrity or with a low integrity, depending on the capacities of the host countries where emission reductions take place, or depending on the standards that the buyers can decide to set. Time will tell. But for now, some countries have decided to come out and call for the highest possible standards. They are under the San Jose Principles Coalition. Finance is a key piece of the puzzle because finance or solidarity internationally and ambition are intricately linked. Finance was marked this year by an emblematic promise made in 2009 in Copenhagen to raise $100 billion per year by 2020. What we have seen going into Glasgow was this promise would not be met in 2020. It's likely it will be met only 3 years late in 2023. There has been a plan led by Canada and Germany to understand indicative numbers of climate finance mobilized and provided by developed countries. And we know we're going to fall short of that goal. This is really bad and really serious for the international trust that is key to the global dynamic. But the more substantive goal that was achieved on finance was that countries collectively agreed to double adaptation finance by 2025 in absolute numbers, meaning not in relative terms, but in absolute numbers compared to 2019. This is important because as we delay reducing our emissions, preparing for the impact of climate change becomes a more pressing issue, particularly for vulnerable countries, which are the least responsible for causing climate change. There have also been discussions for setting an even further higher quantified objectives on climate finance after 2025. And I'd just like to finish this outcome of COP by giving an example of some key statements and declarations. This is just a selection. Many other important ones have been achieved. But collectively, countries came together to call for a stop to deforestation by 2030. And there is a lot of money attached to it to help with implementation. Similarly, on methane, which is in particular coming from fossil fuel production, there have been a lot of countries coming from or fossil fuel production or waste or agriculture. There have been a lot of countries coming together to reduce it, which is very important for the effectiveness of avoiding the worst effects of global warming. Countries have also committed to advance the sale of electric vehicles, and there have been some specific agreements of cooperation, notably towards South Africa, to help South Africa transition away from coal and towards clean energy. Now, it's important to remember that this climate action has become a key part of the European Union political project. In 2019, the new Commission has called the Green Deal the new growth strategy. And it's clearly a strategy to reduce emissions while creating jobs. It's also a lot, as Frans Timmermans said, about improving people's well-being and keeping our people in good health, our planet in good health for future generations. So it's not just about protecting the planet, but really, you know, the fact that it's about people is at the center of this whole project. And it's also a very comprehensive framework about, reducing pollution, enhancing biodiversity, tackling the agricultural and food system, but also sectors like transport or industry. And at the heart is also the question of leaving no one behind, meaning social justice should be important, and regions and people affected should be compensated to ensure we help them transition, and also making sure that EU climate ambition is coherent with what the science says. So in light of the latest available science, in 2018, there was also a decision to achieve climate neutrality, meaning not just neutrality for CO2, carbon, but also all the other gases. And it's important when we only tend to remember the dates, but actually the gases you're considering, the greenhouse gas you're considering, is a very important part of the ambition of the package. And so the climate law this year decided to enhance the target by at least 55% reduction compared to 1990. It used to be minus 40%, and to have a specific package to put the European Union in line with this new target. And this is the Fit for 55 package that was proposed on 14th of July and still needs to be debated and adopted by European countries. It's a massive legislative package that will revise a lot of existing instruments, such as carbon cap and trade system, but also directives on renewable energy, energy efficiency, performance of buildings. But there are also new instruments. Among those, the most emblematic is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is about, partly protecting the industries in Europe, which would have tougher and more stringent regulations, and ensuring they have a level playing field globally. But this has raised, of course, a lot of worry internationally with partners, and the way this is going to be implemented will matter a lot for the EU credibility. So as a conclusion, I would say global agreements can strengthen the dynamic for domestic climate action, and the Paris Agreement is a good framework which gives a common direction and a shared framework for transparency, which, as I said, is the glue that binds everyone's action together. And there's also a rhythm for revisiting action to make sure that we close the gap between our common objectives and what countries decide to do. So it's important that each country play their part in this global agreement. And climate action is clearly now part of EU political project, a way to greater prosperity and more well-being to its population. Thank you.
Благодарю вас за такой прекрасный
Lola, thank you very much for such a great presentation, which summarized the results of COP26. And I believe that it put a foundation to our session for everyone to understand what we are talking about in terms of the agreements achieved from the perspective of the difficulties faced during achieving those agreements, kind of fault lines which we can see in these agreements in terms of the carbon credits and the renewed NDCs. I'd like to thank you on the civil society position, this highlight, as it was very important in mass media, how it covered the social and civil society participation. It was mentioned that the civil society position was increasing, but this is the voice which should be listened to, which should be reacted to. And I do believe that we will get back to you with the questions after we're going to listen to all our speakers today. I'd like to thank you a lot. I'd like to give the floor to Dhruba Purkayastha, who is India Director and USICEF Director of the Climate Policy Initiative. Dhruba, could you share, please, your perspective on the results of COP26, on the current transformation which is happening in international agreements, international commitments concerning global economy in line with these challenges? What are we to expect in the near future?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this session. Thank you, Anastasia, for setting the context very well in line with what is happening globally. And Lola, an excellent presentation summarizing climate action international agreements timeline up to COP26. With this background in place, I do not have a presentation, but I would basically start with addressing the theme of this discussion session. Can international agreements, climate agreements, make politics green? Before I go there, just a small correction. India did not sign Kyoto Protocol, did not ratify in 1997, but India ratified in 2002. Yes, it did not do in 98. It ratified in 2002. And yes, India was a participant in that for till, let's say, 2012. I'll come to that point. I have been also asked to summarize a short piece that I had written on Project Syndicate Sustainability magazine on India's green growth imperative. So I'll come to that later, but just let me start with addressing. Whether the politics go green or not, the problem that we are faced with is global, right? The problem that we are faced with is an issue of global public good. It's an issue of global commons. Now, in order to address an issue, I would sort of tend to be more inclined to a yes over here, because in my mind, I think international agreements is possibly the starting point to go ahead. And I think Paris Agreement, as Lola also said, provides the base for countries to act. It was interesting that you have an official COP and a side COP, and it's an excellent perspective over there that the side COP does bring in a lot of players who are not that official, not that government negotiation, but yes, the government negotiation and the Glasgow Pact sets a lot of actions which have already been described. If we look at the problem very clearly, that it's a problem we have currently sitting, we are sort of on a runway, right? And a point of no return is 10 years away. We need to bend the curve. So it's not a problem of a country A versus country B, which is where politics comes in. But principally, we all tend to say that we are all in it together. So the point is, I am not a scientist, but I believe what IPCC says. I believe what science says. And we assume that, as you also presented, Lola, in terms of saying these actions are required. If we meet the NDC actions till 2030, where we are at 2.4 degrees. Now, assuming these were to be true, the perspective that is required from international agreements is to bend the curve by 2030. That's what we are coming to. In order to bend the curve, what we are left with and what international politics comes in terms of greening, maybe that is because of technology, but we are dealing with the problem of flow. We sort of ignore the problem of stock. So if you are saying 440, 450 parts per million is what we can go to, we are already there at 390 or 400. So we are left with a small runway, and it is important that it is bent unless there is technology to change the stock. So that's where I'm coming from. And if you look at all international agreements, this is an important perspective to understand and essentially take a stock of what is it that can be done. Okay, having said international agreements is a good way forward, but we have not also seen action on various fronts. Let me start with a slightly different perspective here. We have countries' NDC commitments, which are domestic, which are sort of NDC commitments, which are given. A stock take is there, is a step form that we are trying to take as far as NDC is concerned. Countries, it is good to see that countries have revised their NDCs commitments upward in Glasgow and COP26. And that's bringing in ambition on the part of countries to do so. And I think there's a global recognition across the board today, but at various points of time, we have seen various disagreements, because you are coming to a situation where you're faced with politics, necessarily so as one large country drops out. of the Paris Agreement and joins in. Look, I mean, there is a commitment to an international agreement which needs to be maintained consistently. Consistent maintaining the commitments to international agreements becomes very important. But that I would like to highlight two important constructs. And I think I'll refer back to the context, which Anastasia said very brilliantly, is to see that while climate change is a problem globally, mitigation actions can have consequences which are sort of impact a lot of other development negatively. And at the same time, we are also faced with adaptation requirements, which the consequence of climate change brings it onto the countries. Now let's look at the world. Where is the politics? Where is the world coming in? You have vulnerable countries which have to make a larger amount of public investments. Because you are vulnerable, those countries are vulnerable, there are more floods, more adaptation requirements, coastline sinking, water levels rising, whatever the case may be, and they are not all developed and rich countries. Faced with adaptation, we are talking of adaptation finance not being adequate. So there is a key over here to understand that some part of climate change impact is already upon us and is happening. And it is important to international agreements to direct public finance over there. I'll come to the point of finance separately because we've kept that, and that's the area there where I critically work in. I would like to end this part of my conversation by saying the element of common but differentiated responsibility is something in principle which underlies the international climate agreement in spirit. But I do not think the last 5 years of Paris Agreement have seen that to be translated into action. Glasgow COP does provide some glimmer of hope of just transition, and that's a separate point that I would like to bring into address. But when you say common but differentiated responsibilities, I think two things good about COP26 and laying out, and this is in context to the question, Anastasia, you asked me, is to say that COP26 does lend us two important directions, A, on climate finance, and 2, on Article 6. It at least sets the rules of certain game, which was not there till now. But yes, the key point is common but differentiated responsibility. As a concept, it's fine. But in order to implement it, there are political manifestations which keep happening. Let me now shift to a few constructs which have been talked about. We have a net zero direction. Nothing wrong with that direction, but pretty hard to implement. And you're talking of net zero at what level? At a country level, at a corporate level, at an entity level. So net zero as a concept is essentially, do all countries have the institutional monitoring and evaluation methods to measure scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions? Is there adequate capacity with the international institutions to be able to implement the same in all countries so they're able to measure and report it? Yes, there is an aspect of double counting which can be eliminated as far as credits is concerned. Well, let's understand net zero. In principle, the trajectory is great, but that requires a lot of capacity in a lot of less developed countries, which does not exist today in terms of institutional mechanisms of making that happen. I will now shift to what was mentioned in the context in a very interesting manner, the EU Green Deal. I think the EU Green Deal is excellent. It's an excellent mechanism of saying that I have, and it's a beautiful construct of saying all the actions that we do in terms of growth, and this is what I relate to when I talk about India's green growth imperative. I'll just mention that towards the end of what I'm talking. But yes, if you summarily sort of look at the EU Green Deal, they comprehensively cover, and that was there in Lola's presentation, comprehensively cover all possible actions of growth, including reduction by 55% and so on. The only point which I'm not very clear on is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, a carbon border adjustment mechanism is an issue of where you're saying that, yes, I do have to be green as Europe, but at the same point of time, there should not be any leakage from the rest of the world because I am going green. I'm not too sure as to how this will translate, and this has implications on trade. This has implications on WTO. This has implications of tariffs. So what we are saying here, as an enforcement mechanism, yes, there is an imposition if Europe is a market. Therefore, there is an imposition from goods from Asia, Southeast Asia, in terms of what can get into Europe, in terms of their abilities to sort of meet the stringent emission requirements on the path to net zero. On the feasibility of whether a Vietnam or even an Indonesia or a Thailand would be able to cope up, and there is a huge global value chains which work across from finished products to electronics to automotive components, which work across Asia and Europe. Not too sure but this is exactly where politics is coming in. It is a question of, is it a trade tariff? Is it a carbon tariff? Time will tell. Does it actually improve competitiveness? Does it improve incomes for less developed countries? Does it create the benefits of development, and do people get out of poverty in less developed countries because of this? I, as of now, do not know. But yes, it does have implications of how jobs get created, how investments happen in developing countries for sure. So there is an important implication of EU Green Deal on developing countries. In some ways, some developing countries who have the capacity and the institutional and the financial strengths will cope up by improving their supply chains. But I'm not too sure about whether it is a just transition. This is what we would like to call a just transition or not. Not really sure about it. Time will tell how it pans out. I would now like to come to finance, and I think this has been mentioned. Finance looks like a commitment of 100 billion per year, and that was Copenhagen, and that was 10 years ago and not Paris. So we are talking of a commitment of 100 billion per year, which I think it's almost like a broken record in every COP. Now you're saying that it will be met from 2020 onwards, which I do not know, but if you actually count the numbers, 100 billion for 10 years is $1 trillion. It's not much if you look at Annex 1 countries. If I go back to development and my World Bank hat at some point of time, I would basically say that if there was commitment to official development assistance of 0.7% of GDP, this commitment through an international mechanism could have been done, but we are not seeing these commitments come across. Hopefully they will improve, but this is where the finance part of it, the finance part of what is climate finance? The developing world also faces a problem as to what is climate finance. Is climate finance all official development assistance that is loans? If you look at the OECD report, if you look at independent think tank reports, you'll see that climate finance primarily ends up getting counted as loans and not grants. It is not grants. It gets counted as loans. So a developing country borrows from a multilateral institution any which way to build schools and roads. So that's a borrowing which a developing country is doing from IBRD, and it pays it back. Do you count that as climate finance? So there are definitional issues which exist in developing countries, India included, as to what is climate finance and what is climate finance coming from, let's say, the Part 1 or Annex 2 countries towards the developing countries in terms of addressing these global goods. Why do I say, Anastasia, as you lead the context, that there is a compounding conflict here? there is a compounding conflict because your trajectories do not always converge. Because if those countries take those actions, now let me bring in a climate policy initiative and our reports that we work on, increasing access to clean energy or increasing just access to energy. You still have close to 1 billion people in the world 2 years ago. Now it's probably 700 million people who do not have access to energy, who do not have access to modern energy. Energy is closely correlated with poverty. So it is important that these are sequenced. These are sequenced to make energy clean at the same point of time. Energy access for just about clean cooking and just about bare electricity, which is not available. You have India, however, did a good job over the last 3 years in terms of increasing access to electricity in the last 5 years. But if I were to be talking to you 5 years ago, India had 250 million people without access to electricity. Now that is a public initiative, that a public policy initiative or a public investment initiative, which has probably enabled access to electricity to 200 million people. So we are talking of large numbers. We're talking of large numbers of people globally without access to energy. And here comes the question of just transition. When we look at the just transition in making, so the importance of global politics, if global politics becomes and focuses on just transition, yes, I would call it global politics does become green. Coming to climate finance, when we said 100 billion, we are talking about, and we track this every year in a global landscape report that we publish from CPI, which we track over the last 5 years. We've been tracking this in saying, what is climate finance? What is being invested globally? It has grown up from 400 billion to, let's say, around 700 billion, the last report that we have for 2021. But it does fall far short of what trillions of dollars all pundits, all institutions seem to say that needs to be invested in. And adaptation finance is, again, far short than what is required. So we are in a situation where finance is not going to where it is required to go in terms of whether it is public investments or private market investments. Therefore, in order to make finance go to climate mitigation and adaptation, there have to be a role which this international agreements and institutions play. And I think that over here, it should be independent of politics of trade, politics between countries, politics between blocs, green blocs or trading blocs or so on. If you create green trading blocs, you're going to exclude the rest of the world because trade is beneficial for development. You will end up excluding the rest of the world from the benefits of development. So I think I'm exceeding the time that I have, but I would just like to end over here saying that I would like to see net zero get effectively implemented, but there is capacity, knowledge, databases, institutions, and skills required. And yes, a just transition. And the last point, yes, coal needs to be transited to, but how does coal transit from these countries is very important. It is encouraging to say that even India has signed up to, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and South Africa have signed off to ending fossil fuels. And that's very encouraging, sure. But the world needs to find a mechanism through international agreements without getting into negative politics, a way forward to this just transition. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Dhruba, за...
Thank you very much, Dhruba, such a presentation which highlighted all the questions raised within our today's agenda. You touched upon the internal domestic policy, external policy, and talking about the developing countries particularly, and those the problems which we face in terms of the finance. And on my behalf, I would like to mention that there are some problems with the domestic policy when India, for example, is required to work with the millions of households not to burn biomass, to talk to millions of farmers to stop burning different substances which have huge impact on the climate agenda. And you need to interact with the million of companies to persuade them not to burn coal this is a big domestic policy context. And apart from those international cooperation and the position of India on the results in COP26, there is a big set of issues concerning domestic policy. I would like to thank you a lot for a very comprehensive statement, and like to give the floor to another participant of ours, Igor, Tomberg, professor of the Sub-Department of Applied Analysis of International Problems of MGIMO University. After your presentation, we will be happy to start our QA session. Igor, so maybe it would be interesting to listen to your opinion on COP26. Russia didn't join some of the declarations and joined some of other declarations. They didn't join the co-initiative and so on and so forth. So what are your expectations on our next steps and our international commitments in this respect? We'll be happy to listen to your opinion. You know, the opinion on a Glasgow conference is in line with the International Energy Agency. If it is not a failure, it's definitely not success. I'm very thankful to Lola for her great presentation. And I have even more questions concerning the situation which we see right now globally. But nevertheless, great presentation, Lola, so thank you a lot. Everything happening in Glasgow is outlined and summarized. Well, I see for the first time, scientific approach. Nevertheless, regardless of this tone or mood in Glasgow, I'd like to be an advocate for this fossil fuel, which are criticized a lot, without which, as it turns out, over the last months, it's just impossible to live without them. I'm not sure how it's going to happen after 2030, but I believe it's going to be something like today. So the energy crisis in China, energy crisis in Europe. The US faced it a little bit earlier in Texas, if you remember. Everything was connected with the overestimation of the renewables, which might work under particular circumstances and which doesn't work under other circumstances. If they work, they do not work in the way we are satisfied with. How should we dispose of the excess energy and to get this insufficient energy at particular peak times? So Glasgow happened in the wrong time, from my perspective. There was already the energy crisis in Europe. The Europeans started to increase coal production. They started to back commission coal mines, which gives us a real picture. When everything is great, we fight climate change, but when it is cold, we will postpone this question. In China, we see the same situation, as China is trying to fight emission. The situation is very complicated in China, particularly when we're talking about the environment protection. But to conduct campaigns to phase out coal, it's quite early for them. 60% of their power energy mix is generated with the help of coal, and 10 to 11% gas generated power. So this replacement will cost several trillion US dollars to substitute coal power stations by natural gas power stations. So you need to liberalize the market to create infrastructure. It's a long, long way, but the weather is cold. And again, we see the closed factories. And very soon we will see the we will see in lockdowns. At the same time, as for the questions whether international agreements can turn the politics green, they actually may, as this is a very, very buzzy idea.
Now that a lot of people around the world think that something needs to be done about climate change, I think that policies might become greener. But I have some hesitations about alliances, because alliances in some cases can play a negative role. I totally agree with what Mr. Purkayastha said about climate finance. It sounds a bit vague to me. Nobody really knows what to do about that. First of all, where will this money come from? This 100 billion? Will it come out of a pocket? No. Lola had this wonderful picture of a man turning his pockets inside out, showing that the pockets are empty. Okay, then there is the matter of trans-border carbon tax. This will affect metal producers, which is why Russia refused to sign this declaration. Then coal a little later on. So basically, we'll have to pay for it, and that's why we don't like it. So this is where the dividing line is. All LNG has been sent to Asia. Europe was left with no LNG. Europe's getting cold and still refuses to certify Nord Stream 2. But that's another matter. So again, all these dividing lines, why did all LNG go to Asia? Because prices are high there. Europeans refuse to pay such a price. That's why traders sent their LNG to Asia instead. So what kind of an agreement are we talking about? Signing some kind of a deal between Europe and Asia? I don't think it sounds realistic. Okay, let me share another point about international agreements. Let's say we stop consuming fossil fuels. But how will we replace fossil fuels? Solar energy, wind energy, at this point, they're a bit unstable. They cannot cover our needs 100%. But what about nuclear energy? It's not fossil fuel. It's clearly a renewable source, but for some reason, it's also being anathematized. So how can we accomplish this energy transition? It's a big question. I think we can't do without nuclear power, nuclear energy. Solar and wind won't be sufficient alone. So you have these two camps. There are countries that build nuclear power plants and those who shut them down. France and Germany, as always. Russia, China, the United States, by the way, we are quite fond of nuclear energy. So I think nuclear energy will play a pretty big role going forward. Anyway, lots of problems. And I think the most important thing right now is to avoid making rash decisions. We need to build a structure for this transition, avoiding this double crediting, double accounting with the credits. We do need to set up a smart system of regulation. We need to be careful with the trans-border carbon tax adjustment. These are all very sensitive, very painful issues. And we do need to find sources of funding. We do need to find finance. mankind is not at the point yet where, how do I put it? It's not just like some rich countries could chip in and build something that poor countries need. Poorer countries like India and African countries will continue cutting down trees and burning wood to make themselves warm. And Russia, even though Russia refused to sign some documents at Glasgow, and just like India, we did not sign the Kyoto Protocol immediately, although we did sign it later on. Still, Russia's position is somewhat skeptical because Russia very much depends on hydrocarbons, very much depends on fossil fuels. Our economy is built on that. At the same time, I agree. We have a long-term strategy for Russia prepared for the period until 2050 with the low emissions. So we are willing to reduce our emissions by 33%. The reason we don't have a more ambitious goals like other countries, 50%, etc. Let's take hydrogen, for example. Where are we going to take hydrogen? We have to produce gas in order to get hydrogen. So we will continue producing natural gas and oil, and I think even coal. So we shouldn't hurry too much. We shouldn't make hasty decisions. So I'm a bit skeptical about the Green Deal, about alliances, because our national interests are different. Our countries are different. So at this point, most countries care about their own interests. International law is above national law, but national interest is above international interest. That's all I have at this point. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tomberg, for presenting Russia's position. In addition to COP26, you also painted the picture of Russia's position, its current economic situation, and the recently approved national strategy, which clearly says that we will only achieve carbon neutrality if our economic situation remains stable. And the president signed this program, pointing out that to us, climate change efforts are very much related to economic growth. And we all know that our economy very much depends on fossil fuels. All right, let's start our Q&A session. I think we'll get quite a few interesting questions. And do we have any questions from the offline audience? Yes, we do have a few hands in the room. Please make sure you introduce yourself, tell us your name and where you come from, and whom your question is intended for.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. My name is Zalina Nigeyeva, Central Asia University, Kyrgyzstan. I would like to thank all of our speakers today.
Vallejo, Lola, and to Purkayastha, Dhruba. So there are some news that Google is going to block those internet resources, papers, opinions that contain information which is controversial to the current climate change agenda. So won't it be a violation of human rights on expression of their opinions? And as I understand, there are no long-term studies on positive impact on emission reduction of those measures that are currently promoted. And what do you think, what's your opinion, whether it is possible, and what might be consequences of this block?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of this move at all as far as blocking news as far as Google is concerned. But just to respond to your question of long-term emission reduction strategy in India, I think footprint is pretty clear. India has committed to increase, it has already met its NDC 10 years before time, and it has committed to increase its NDC commitments roughly by more than 50%, because it was committed to 33% emissions in reduction intensity by 2030, which has been now upped to 49 or 50%. It had committed to renewable energy being 40% capacity, which has gone up to 50% electricity. And India's strategy on emissions reduction is pretty much clear. It takes the route through increasing solar installations, and by progressively increasing solar installations, existing coal power plants will get less and less dispatch. So if I'm talking of emissions for electricity, it is complemented by another policy, which is replacing fossil fuel transport by electric vehicles. So two-pronged strategy. The only area where two-pronged strategy essentially clean up electricity, electrify transportation, which is also a very long-term strategy, both on cleaning the electricity grid and electrifying transportation. These two would significantly contribute, and India is sort of committed to kind of net zero by 2060. I don't have a perspective or numbers by 2060, but I don't relate information blocking in any which way to a long-term emissions reduction strategy. I'm not too sure whether I addressed your question, but maybe you may wish to explain me the context better. Thank you.
I can very briefly react. I think I would like to go back to the use of the term climate agenda. I think it suggests that there is still two sides of a debate. And I would like to maybe go back to the fact that the IPCC acronym stands not for international, but intergovernmental. And it is a very rigorous process whereby scientists do not create new science, but synthesize existing science in a very long process that is ultimately overseen by representatives from all the governments, and including, the Russian government has also in the end adopted the content of the IPCC report, and in particular the summary for policymakers. So just to say that this is now something that is beyond debate, and I think much closer to everyone. We now see much more tangibly the effects of climate change, including wildfires in Siberia, including floodings in Western Europe, the heat dome in Northern America. Examples abound, and I think there's this very concrete feeling that climate change is now closer to people's lives. But we can and we should, of course, debate about the how, but in terms of the science telling us where we need to get to and at what pace, if we want to avoid the worst impacts, that is something that is not open for discussion. But it's up to countries and politicians to find ways to make sure that we do it in a way that is deemed fair and that is deemed as a way to improve the well-being. The health argument is also a powerful one and I think it has been a big driver in phasing down coal in places. It's more for health reason than for good nature protecting the planet reason. It's because it's affecting and killing people first and foremost. And clearly the effects of switching to ambitious emission can be done with detrimental effects for people and nature. It can be done in a way that increases inequalities, in a way that uses a lot of land and is bad for biodiversity, continues bad practice in terms of exploration and mining of new materials needed for batteries, etc. But it's also an opportunity maybe to learn from past destructive practices and to have cities that are more livable, buildings that are, better for people that live and work in them. It's not going to be easy, and I don't want to sound too naive, but it's definitely an opportunity collectively and for all the countries taking part of it. And the questions is about fairness, and clearly the UN should be the focus of the discussion for how to do this in a fair manner.
Спасибо большое за ответы на вопросы. Я предлагаю следовать.
Thank you very much for your responses. We will alternate one question from the offline audience, one question from Zoom. I can see Ekaterina Sokolova raising her hand. Ekaterina, good morning. Thank you very much. Big thank you to all the speakers. They followed one another, very logical sequence, so we saw the comprehensive picture. I work at the Pacific University. I'm a lead researcher there, and I also deal with political matters in my research. So I have a question for all of you. Unfortunately, we are in a situation where these matters are very much politicized. Politics is running ahead of science, you might say, even with the oceanography. The ocean absorbs a lot of CO2, carbon dioxide, because of algae, etc. We do a lot of studies related to that. And we know that there are a lot of different scientific models, different methodologies. With new digital technology, we are able to assess the situation and forecast for a few years ahead. And at the same time, we don't have the results of our research yet governments are taking action right now, today, and we can see some political factors at play here. It's not based on science. It's not. Lola, there is one point where I disagree with you. For example, wildfires. You mentioned wildfires. And actually, this could be beneficial for nature in some respects, because this helps shrubs. They grow even better after wildfires. So you have both positive and negative effects here. Or methane. Let me use methane as an example. With the permafrost thawing, we see cumulative effect there, because this gives us more clouds. Clouds result in lower temperature. So all those climatic mechanisms, it's a very sophisticated system. So let me just say, we shouldn't politicize these issues. We should pay more attention to science. So what do you all think? Will we, at some point, shift to focus on science, or will these matters remain highly politicized? That's my question. I know it's a tricky question, it's a loaded question, but I think we should emphasize science over politics. Yes, I would like to support Ekaterina, and I would like to mention that some scientists express alarm, saying that there are plans to plant forests, but this may result in monocultural plantations, because we'll take land away from farmers. This may undermine agriculture, and this will create some risks for small peoples, indigenous peoples in permafrost areas and climate adaptation, since we don't have proper technology yet in some cases. Anyway, this is just something I wanted to add to Ekaterina's question. So please, your answers, your responses. No, Ekaterina, this was not for you. Well, I can only agree. I think this was a very big question from the very beginning. Is global warming really dangerous? Does it exist? That's the question. You mentioned algae. I would also mention underwater volcanoes. They produce a lot of methane and greenhouse gases, but we all blame man for all the problems, and we need to trim down our energy industry. I think it's somewhat because of international competition. It started with Europe. Europe supports these matters, but it's just because Europe is at the disadvantage in this competition and they want to protect their market. So they use climate change to protect their European market. And that's why they politicize these issues. That's why they talk about wildfires. We have always had wildfires and floods. They have always been there. It's nothing new. And Gulf Stream, it's not man-made factors. It's ridiculous. It's a matter of astronomy, the sun, things that man has nothing to do with. We have no influence over these matters. So I will rather believe in God than in this being an anthropogenic, a man-made factor. So this is highly politicized issue, and politics do affect these matters in a very negative way. That's all I have to say. Okay, thank you, Mr. Tomberg.
Can I say something quickly?
Yes, sure.
Thank you. I think because you mentioned God in your last sentence, if I understood correctly, just to mention that the Laudato Si encyclic from the Pope is also about our imperative to protect the earth. I cannot respond to all the problems. Of course, we are dealing with complex biological systems. There is, for instance, an effect that...
Lola, это не я, это Света вообще задавала вопрос.
No. Lola, don't blame me. The question came from Ekaterina, so it wasn't me saying all those nasty things. So
I love the
Я пытался ответить.
direct questions. I think I cannot convince because it's not my legitimacy, and that's why we have the IPCC. That is a legitimacy that is at least formally recognized by all governments in the world. Then whether this trickles down is not my direct responsibility. Clearly, there are complicated effects, and for instance, reducing coal globally means that aerosols, which have a cooling effect, will not be there, and this could lead to more warming in the short term. And that's why it's important that we reduce methane emissions in the short term, because it has a high warming impact in the short term. But I'm not, a scientist, and if IPCC cannot convince you, then I can only defer to them. But it's important to remind that it's been signed by governments. And there, I warned as well about the tensions with food security or biodiversity. You mentioned, Anastasia, monoplantation. I mentioned that how we were decarbonizing mattered extremely. There is also a starting of a collaboration between the IPCC, the scientific body on climate issues, and the IPBES, the IPBES, which is the scientific body on biodiversity issue. And they have started talking about what it means to transform in a way that is good for climate and good for biodiversity. And it really means, paying attention to the demand side of the equation, and also transforming our demand for energy as well as the way we produce it. I'm not going to deny that it is a political question, and that it is also a question of competition and a question of finding more markets or jumping a train of clean technologies. And it's really part of the narrative of climate action today. I think the fact that wildfires and floods have always existed, and extreme weather events as a whole have always existed, doesn't preclude that they are becoming more frequent and more severe already, and they will only become worse if we do not cut our emissions very quickly. But I don't deny that there is, of course, some politics and some countries which are more directly impacted to by the move away from fossil fuels, and I think that's why we need to keep the discussion open on how we do that. And I know the European Union carbon border adjustment mechanism is one of the most risky ways in which Europe can show it is serious. I think it's a proof that it is serious about the project, but it can also alienate a lot of our potential allies in moving forward.
Но ключевое слово «постепенный».
I think gradual is the operative word here. It has to be gradual. Well, let's say we abandon fossil fuels. What about nuclear energy, though? Why can't you recognize that nuclear energy is green energy? It is dangerous, but it is green. That's.
I'm from France. We have so much nuclear energy. It's down to political. I think we have to recognize also countries' preference, because in countries like Germany or Japan, where they have had bad experiences, they take a political decision to not explore nuclear energy. In many parts of the world, including India and France, will continue to have a large share of electricity of nuclear in its electricity mix. But it doesn't mean that we can completely. We cannot impose this choice on others, and it's part of the national choices to the transition. But I'm not.
Well, not impose, recommend. We have to move on with our discussion. I think there are other participants who want to ask their questions. Yes, atomic energy is a very important issue. And sometimes we try to introduce new technologies which look somewhat dubious at this point. I'm talking about climate adaptation and new technology. For example, carbon capturing technology. In some cases, there are some questions about those technologies as well. So this kind of research should be properly funded, and we should not put the cart before the horse here. We should not start introducing new, potentially dangerous technologies before we properly study those. And by the way, atomic energy, also we have to weigh all the risks. What is actually more dangerous when we consider these things? All right. Thank you very much. I'm from Tajikistan, and I agree with what Mr. Tomberg said about commenting on Lola Vallejo's presentation, and I also thank Mr. Purkayastha. So based on what you just said, I have a few questions or comments. Basically 2 points. Number one, we all know that the UN discussed climate change recently, but we are talking about the international agenda and green policies. Let me just give you an example. In Central Asia, we have observed something very interesting. Recently, there is a kind of struggle for energy resources. So my question to you is, like you said, some countries are more vulnerable to natural disasters. We saw something happening in Russia, in Turkey, etc. So my question to you is, what do you think about attempts by the international community to introduce the use of renewable energy sources, solar power, hydro energy, and what do you think about carbon neutrality? Like Mr. Tomberg said, there is the question of finance. Without proper funding, this work cannot be done. So my question to you is, as experts, who do you think should pay for all that? Thank you.
We should take this question in turn. This is the general question. Igor, you have the mic on. Could you take the first turn to answer the question? The most difficult question is who is to pay for that? The agency which hasn't been created should pay for that. This is a kind of idea of mine that all the rich stakeholders should split the check when we pay our contributions to the UN functioning, so on and so forth. We need to create kind of an agency. I'm against supporting climate red tape by carbon taxes and tariffs. It's not just. And whether European red tape is going to take us to, this is a big question mark. So to be honest, I don't know who is to pay for that. It hasn't been solved. If there is no money, so that's the case. Dhruba, your turn, your answer, please.
1 sec. Thank you. It's an interesting question. Let me just step back. See, when a problem is an economic externality, there are only two ways you can address it. You have to either impose a tax or create a carbon market or an offset mechanism by which you can cap and trade globally. The part one of the problem is, if the world could agree on a price of carbon, which means that it can be taxed in some manner, let all countries tax it, because it is a common global public good that we are addressing. If it were limited within the countries or confined to borders, it could have been country A or a country B. But unfortunately, if you look at the pricing of carbon, it varies so widely. Whether it is pricing of carbon or pricing for reduction of carbon, or can be translated equivalently to a carbon tax. On one side, you have Scandinavia pricing it at $200. On the other side, there is no price to it. It's less than $5. The point is simple. The point is, it is a global public good issue. Therefore, it has to be paid partly at least by the public sector. It has to be collectively paid by the governments of the world in a united manner. There will be some part of it where private investment or the markets can come in, where there are business models, such as renewable energy. You will find it commercially attractive. As storage comes down, you might find batteries to become commercially attractive, and those businesses are going to create. So the governments of the world are creating those markets for those businesses to happen so that businesses become sustainable. Net zero is just a measurement. So there has to be corporations which invest, and therefore these businesses. Coming to adaptation, if you are faced with this problem, and let's talk about adaptation, you'll have to, let's say, build dikes or coastal zone protections or cyclone shelters or what may be heat islands in India in cities, so you have to save people. Now, there will not be any private sector business models here. This is a public problem. This is a problem which rests with the governments. Now, we can say that we are not a contributor and therefore you pay, and you are not a contributor, therefore I pay. I think I am, again, like Lola, I'm not trying to question science. I believe what has been, we are collectively aggregated over here to address a policy solution, a market response, assuming that the science is static and science is constant, and science has told us that this is likely to happen. So that's what it is. So who pays for it? Yes, the governments of the world have to collectively pay for it. Where do they get that money from it? There will have to be, whenever an economic externality and negative externality is created by an economic activity or an economic enterprise, there is a Pigovian in economics, as they call it, a Pigovian tax. So you'll have to get that money, whether you call it a cess or whether you call it a carbon tax, or you price it in some manner and get some market instruments to work. That's the whole problem on Article 6. So you'll have to get the markets to work of what is called ITMO, Internationally Transferable Mitigation Outcomes. Now, once you get part of it, you will get the markets to work, and some part of it will have to be publicly paid. Now, if that entails debt on the countries or printing money, we can deficit financing. We'll come to that later as to how. If the world can save itself from one financial crisis to another pandemic by essentially doing deficit financing, or rather in simple terms, printing money, I'm sure the world can find a way out of the problem, even though it looks very hard. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Вижу комментарии.
Thank you very much. I see that Lola is ready to take the floor.
I don't want to make the response too long, but I think there are some options on the ground to encourage the finance. I support what has been said just now on the various instruments that are there to either give a price on carbon or put in place regulations that can speed up the transition. And I also want to say that ultimately the costs get passed down to consumers and to people. So, and a broader question is also, what do we decide to price? And if we're serious about the climate issue, then we need to move the price away from certain areas to put it on carbon. So that means also reassessing maybe more broadly how we tax income, labor, and things like that to maybe make pricing carbon more acceptable and more feasible in practice. There's also clearly a north-south problem in having this solidarity. And I think so far, a lot of the money allocated to development cooperation has been directed towards spurring the transition in the global south, but we need to go faster. And some proposals have been put forward, for instance, to reform the International Monetary Fund and use the special drawing rights, for instance, as a potential pool of money that could fund at scale the transition in the global south. There are many options. None is perfect, and I agree that we should pay attention to the sustainability of debt in the global south. That's probably the most important factor to take into consideration.
Спасибо большое, Lola, за ваш комментарий.
Thank you, Lola, for your input. I see that we have a lot of questions in our room. In Gorchakov Foundation, I would suggest the following format for us to be able to take all the questions within 20 minutes left for our today's discussion. Let's do the following. Each participant is going to voice the question and going to say who should take the answer, and then we give the final word to each speaker, to each expert, for them to be able to take these questions by summarizing some of the answers to the questions. Anna, would you assist me in moderating so-called collection of questions from our audience? You may take it in turn. Introduce yourself, voice a question, and voice who you ask the question.
I'm from Georgia, and I study in People Friendship University. I'm doing my PhD, and my question is: how do you think will COVID-19 pandemic affect to climate change?
Давайте мы сейчас соберем все вопросы и потом.
Let's take all the questions, and it was a question to Lola, and Lola will take the question. Next question.
Good morning. My name is Mishishna Elizaveta, alumnus of Moscow State University, Samara, Moscow. And I have a short question also to Lola Vallejo. How would you assess the role of youth activism in climate agenda? In your opinion, do activities of young people influence decision makers and politicians? Thank you.
Еще вопросы из аудитории?
Other questions? My name is Anara. I'm from Kyrgyzstan. My question is the following. What should developing countries like Kyrgyzstan, such vulnerable countries, replace coal in the forthcoming 5 years? If there is energy dependence on water, there is no stable economy, what kind of replacement should we have? Do you have any plans in Western countries? Thank you for your... Whom do you ask the question? Good day. A question to Anastasia. From your perspective, we've been working within this dialogue framework. There were some questions related to the world climate, and there was a position that the theory of global warming is a false theory. For example, based on Central Asian countries, we feel that there is a process of glaciers melting, and you are the head, the CEO of the Baikal Lake Foundation. Do you believe that this is a false theory, or the world is really in the phase of global warming? Yeah, I've taken note of the question, and at the end of the discussion, I will try to take this question. Anastasia? That's it? That's it? So we may start with answers. Yeah, there is one more question, sorry. So let's have our final question.
Hello, I've got a question to Mr. Dhruba Purkayastha. My name is George Gigashvili, and I'm representing Georgia. So United Nations, the 2030 agenda was for sustainable development, which was adopted by all UN member states in 2015. Well, 2015 was the year when COVID-19 pandemic did not exist, and we knew nothing about that yet. So one of the sustainable development goals is climate action. But nowadays, as the COVID-19 pandemic exists in our world, and as there were restrictions for international and domestic flights, for example, also for driving cars, and there were full lockdowns in many countries. So how do you think how it can affect on climate action? And if we can say that COVID-19 pandemic helps us to develop one of the sustainable development goals, such as climate change, climate action.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Отлично, я думаю, что мы можем перейти
That's
тогда.
great. We can start our QA session. The biggest number of questions to Lola Vallejo. Lola, maybe you take the floor.
Thanks. I'll start with the first and the last questions are very similar. It's about the impact of COVID-19. I think we should be very careful to affect any kind of positive trait to a health pandemic, which has caused innumerable death and well, destruction in economies and societies. First, I think what COVID-19 has what it could teach us, and we haven't learned the lesson for now, is our interconnectedness. And COVID-19 problem we see now with the Omicron variant is an issue of solidarity. It does not make sense that in places we are doing our third or fourth booster shot, having another injection, when so many places in the world have not received their first dose. And we have not delivered again on commitments of delivering doses on time. And we're not also having discussion about waiving the international patent on the vaccine. And that means that as a result, even the wealthier countries are less protected because it allows the disease to develop new forms, which then come back to attack them. So I think it should teach us that without coordinated action and strong solidarity principles, we're not going to defeat this. And I think the parallel with climate is very clear. COVID-19, despite this very strong economic and social impact, has not done a dent in emission reductions, just because our economies right now are too structured and too wired around fossil fuels and carbon intensive production and consumption. So even if we had a pandemic every year for the next 20 years, we would still not meet our targets. And it's not really about, but it's an indication that even if we halt economic system and even if we have lockdowns, we do not reduce emissions sufficiently, just because a lot of our economy, including heating, electricity production, and others, are very linked to carbon intensive ways. So COVID cannot help us achieve climate or sustainable development goals. And if anything, it's a reminder of what we have to do differently. I'll come to the second question, which was about the role of youth activism. Personally, when I was a young person, I was not very sure that it was having any impact to protest. And I always thought it was better to vote. And now, having been closer to decision makers and to international arenas, I have changed my mind, because I have seen the actual impact that youth movements have had in places where they have been very strong. I have seen the fact that a lot of companies, including fossil fuel companies, are now struggling or have to do a lot more efforts to try and recruit people, even with good paying jobs in places like France and others. So as you know, with the relationships with people in power, with the influence they can have as future employees, I think the youth movement has really managed to put more urgency in the climate action movement. And in many cases, this has escalated to even the United Nations Secretary General level, which I think acts a lot more like someone who is convinced of the emergency of doing something on climate. So I think it does influence politicians, certainly more than I thought before.
Спасибо большое. Я думаю, что мы можем перейти.
Thank you. We may go to our next speaker. Dhruba, the floor is yours, please. There was a question to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I can kind of completely agree with what Lola just said in the global nature of the problem, in the global common nature of the problem. It's just that in climate, it's very obvious. There is nothing that you can do to close your borders. And that's where I'm coming to. In vaccines, it's coming back. If you can close your borders, it doesn't really work for that matter. So you have to vaccinate the world. Until everybody is not safe, you're not safe. So we have a problem which is absolutely similar, parallel in nature. And I hope the governments learn. And I hope the governments learn, in addition to what Lola said, I hope the government and the politicians learn that there is an intergenerational equity element. You need to look beyond the 5 years you have in politics, in power, in most countries of the world. And that's important. And that's exactly where the youth movement possibly drives that understanding. So that's the point. Coming back to saying, I am concerned on this COVID-19 plus climate change issue without trying to draw any relationship between the two. I'm not trying to draw any relationship. But let's understand also that there is an issue of public finances. So I am not too sure how public finances will shape up in many countries of the world, because there has been a loss of economic output. There has been a loss of economic taxes. There has been a loss of public revenues. So for the fiscal position to cope up and therefore continue to invest in climate change and in transition. And so, yes, there is a question. There is a question of how public finances will be able to cope up. And that's where I link COVID-19 to continued action on continued climate action, particularly on transition, particularly on transitioning from a fossil fuel-based economy. So I see problems which are more public finance, fiscal in nature. And the earlier point, which I said, yes, the importance of recognizing that this is a global issue and it's not limited to your borders alone. And therefore, therefore the issue of being intergovernmental action, collective action on financing and investment becomes very important. Thank you.
Да, спасибо большое.
Thank you.
И тогда я передаю заключительное.
I'd like to give the floor to Igor Tomberg on the questions which have been voiced. We had some open questions, so could you please take the floor? I don't remember the question to me. There were no questions to you personally, but there were some open questions. So if you have anything to add to the positions voiced, so we'll be happy to listen to your input. Totally agree that both problems, coronavirus and the climate change, are of global nature. The question is about the global awareness of the problems that everybody should understand. We need to fight these two problems since the climate is changing. It doesn't matter why it is changing because of our activity, but we need to fight this somehow. And Lola said a key word: we need to do it gradually. We shouldn't rush. We shouldn't do it in a rush manner, collapsing different industries, companies. Everything should be in a very consistent way. And that's how I summarize our activities. I'd like to thank all the participants, all the colleagues, and the audience for attention. I'd like to thank the Foundation of Gorchakov. Thank you for this summary. I do see that we have one more question in the room. Let's voice this question, and then we will be ready to close the session. Thank you for this opportunity, Yulia Melnikova, MGIMO University. I have an aftertaste of our discussion. NATO, we haven't discussed NATO. There was a revolutionary idea expressed at the last summit of NATO. That alliance will join the program to fight against climate change, and will work out the mechanism to reduce emissions in military. As I believe, it is a very interesting precedent, which we didn't see before. I have a question to Lola and to Mr. Tomberg. Is it real? Can we monitor this process, or is it kind of an attempt of NATO to join this popular agenda? And the question to Igor: do you believe that it is possible to at least discuss emission reduction in military? Because I believe this is a great issue. Thank you. Lola, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I forgot to answer a previous question on what to replace coal with from Kyrgyzstan, for instance. I mentioned it very quickly, but there was a dedicated package towards South Africa of $8.5 billion over 5 years from the United States, European Union, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom to try and support South Africa to transition away from coal and to support its electric company, Eskom, which has gone into bankruptcy. It cannot be replicated everywhere, but it's still a pilot that shows how with dedicated targeted support, there can be acceleration of action, but we need broader, more systemic solutions as well, as I mentioned before. the idea that NATO will join climate change fights, I think is not surprising because in many senses, the climate issue will resonate with people differently depending on their own interests. And I think it's interesting that even under the era of Donald Trump presidency in the United States, when clearly the government did not want to do anything on climate change, but still the US military had a report that was warning of the potential impacts of climate change on its own installations. And I think the military is attuned to the issue of climate because it's aware of the potential security impacts. So I can't say anything about the NATO goodwill or credibility to actually do something, but two things are true. The military will be anyway part of the emergency responses that we will have in places to extreme weather events that are becoming more frequent and more severe with climate change. So they will have a part to play. And that's why also you have more discussions of climate issues at the Security Council of the United Nations, because it's also seen as a maximizer of risks in conflict-prone regions. And it's also true that the military is, in many cases, a big emitter of greenhouse gases, because in many respects, their infrastructure is very inefficient or very intense in carbon emissions. So they also have to consider what their footprint is. But anyway, they will be part, sadly, of the rising risks posed by climate change. But I think going back to the previous question on coal and how can we replace it, it really shows the importance of international dialogue and cooperation to advance this question, which is why I'm so honored to have been invited today. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Лола. Игорь Римуальдович.
Lola, thank you very much. Igor? The question about NATO
Также был обращен к вам.
was also addressed to you.
Насчет НАТО сказали же.
But the question has been answered.
К вам тоже был обращен.
But there was also a question to you.
Я должна обязательно уточнить.
So I have to clarify whether you agree to that or there are any additions.
Если нет, тогда я предлагаю
If there is nothing to add, I would suggest we wrap up our discussion,
риторическим ответом будет
and
ответ на вопрос.
the answer to the question which was addressed to me as the head of non-profit organizations responsible for nature preservation concerning the climate change, the reasons behind that. We have seen a lot of them and implications which cannot be denied in terms of the global warming and the long-term increase in average temperature on the Earth, which has been happening over 100 years. And one of the key reasons is the man-made reason. I'd like to give the information of monitoring, supported by our fund, the Baikal Sea state, the ecosystem of the point number one. Over 75 years, we've seen the monitoring process, and the monitoring shows the dynamics that the surface temperature of the lake has increased by 1 degree. If the deep water temperature hasn't been changing, so we see the change in the surface temperature and the Baikal Lake. It is becoming warmer. It is a global trend, and it reflects, being the deepest lake, it reflects the fact connected with the global warming and with the implications ecosystem faces. As a result of this global warming, the lake is changing in terms of its composition. So the scientists also keep record of the change in the temperature, the climate change. That's what we cannot deny, and that's what we have to deal with inside the country and internationally. Developing this international dialogue, which we have been talking today. On my behalf, I would like to thank all the experts and speakers for great presentations, for very detailed and deep answers to the questions. I'd like to thank our audience and our guests, which made it possible to have this discussion possible. Thanks to these interesting questions, we have the dialogue encompassing many factors and facts of the international dialogue dedicated to climate change, green finance, and those prospects which we are to face in the years to come. I'd like to thank the Fond of Gorchakov for arranging this particular discussion and for inviting me to be a moderator. I'd like to thank Anastasia. We have a round of applause in our room. I hope you hear that. I'd like to thank our distinguished and prominent speakers for finding time to join us from different parts of the world to give your expertise in this particular issue. The Foundation of Gorchakov is planning to discuss a climate agenda in a scientific and very unbiased manner. Would like to continue to do that. So we'll be very happy to invite you to this discussion for us to have kind of expert, productive cooperation among different states and countries. As during this agenda, we need to work together. Thank you very much and see you soon. All the best to you. And the announcement to our participants, both online and offline. Our next session is going to start a bit earlier. We're going to have it 12:20 Moscow time. Please note that. So stay tuned.